Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Paula Fass, who is an emerita professor of history at UC Berkeley, also the author of a number of books, called Kidnapped, a book called Children of a New World, also edited the Routledge, or is it Routledge, right? History of Children in the West, a memoir called Inheriting the Holocaust, and the most recent book, this one, The End of American Childhood. And all of these books are about childhood. And I think childhood is a topic that historians haven't really paid a great deal of attention to, even though it makes up a pretty substantial chunk of all of our lives. Well, first of all, welcome, Paula. Glad you could join.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very eager to talk about childhood and why we've missed it.
Yeah,
Historians have missed it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery because obviously it shows up in art, it shows up in movies, and it shows up in culture. But in history, it's sort of ignored. And I guess part of that is because, history has always concerned itself with things like, politics and inventions and so forth. And so childhood didn't seem like something worthy of study. But I think, you point out that the culture of a society is going to be manifested in its view of childhood. And in particular, the political view of society is going to show up in childhood. And this is a notion that goes all the way back to, I think, Locke and Rousseau, and certainly to de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville said that Americans had, of course, a very distinctive political culture, but they also had a very distinctive view of childhood. And I guess one question that we all have is American childhood still distinctive, right? Or has the rest of the world caught up? Or has the U.S. sort of, merged with everything else? So I guess the first question that I would have is, how distinctive has American childhood actually been? And is it sort of in part a cause or a consequence of the unique political culture that we have in America?
Well, that's two questions, and I think I'll try to deal with the second one a little bit first. It's both, of course. I mean, on the one hand, the childhood reflects larger aspects of American culture and American politics. On the other, the way we treat our children also affects them later as citizens of the Republic. And that's one of the things that the Founding Fathers were well aware of and were very interested in having a different American childhood so that American children would become effective citizens of the Republic, would become independent, could be depended on to be independent and not dependent beings. So those things are distinctly, they're connected to each other. The first question is much more complicated. Have we become more like the rest of the world? Have they become more like us? Well, we started out very different in the early 19th century. Start with that. And that was partly the inheritance of the revolution, but it was also a variety of other factors in American history. One of them was the tremendous availability of land, which changed the whole negotiation between generations. And Tocqueville was very aware of that. In other words, children did not have to depend on inheriting land from their fathers. We're talking about men children here, because women could not own property in their own right yet. So they could go out and get land on their own and establish themselves in this vast American continent. So that changed things tremendously. The other thing that changed things, and here it's a more subtle kind of issue, and that is American mothers had a larger role in their families than European mothers. Now, that doesn't mean they were equal to their husbands. That was not the case. Certainly, they didn't have political equality. But it does mean that very early on, they were given a role in child rearing that in Europe, for example, and in other parts of the world, was still not legitimized as a female role. So American patriarchalism was challenged early on. Again, I want to be very careful. That doesn't mean that women were either feminists or liberated, but it does mean that their role in child rearing was greater. And that had consequences. It had consequences for how children were brought up. So I would argue that those things, plus one more little thing, and that is the fact that Americans emphasized education very early on, and public education early on too. Schooling was built into the Northwest, now I'm forgetting the name of but when the Northwest was organized, there were schools where schooling was set aside. And except for the South, where schooling was not common, Americans were very accustomed to schooling. So there were a variety of factors that set American children apart from European children in the 19th century. Okay. When you deal with the 20th century and the post-World War II, what you get is European lives becoming much more similar to American lives. That was quite intentional. I mean, it was a democratization of the culture and an understanding, especially in Germany, for example, that the kind of authoritarian patriarchalism had very negative political consequences. And there was a massive expansion of education. So all the things that Americans had more than 100 years earlier, Europeans began to imitate. Democracy, more role for women in child rearing and in the home in general, schooling. The one thing they didn't have, of course, was more land. That was an aspect that was unique to the United States in the early 19th century. But so after World War II, American child rearing and European child rearing begin to become much more alike. Now, the question of where we are now is an interesting question. We in the United States becoming aware of the fact that we're no longer so unique, have become much more conscious about not giving our children as much leeway as we used to have. What I call the managed child, helicoptering and a variety of things like that, has now become a very common American experience precisely because we're worried that the kind of mobility, both geographic and social, and as a result economic, that we used to have, is now no longer a given. We are competing in a very different world than we were competing with before. And so trying to give our children a leg up, and the fear that in fact their mobility will be downward mobility, has led American parents to organize their children's lives much more than they have ever before. That and the ubiquity of schooling to much later periods of life. So that whereas schooling in the 19th century usually meant that you went to school for 6 years, on and off. It was not constant, on and off, a little bit on now and a little bit then. By the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States, high school was a common experience, which it was not at all in Europe. After the Second World War, those things change, but the United States begins to emphasize college education. So you get more and more education, more and more management of childhood, both through the family and through educational institutions. And the question of the kind of independence that children had, their autonomy, we talk about it more and more, and we provide it less and less. So I don't know whether Europeans might not be ahead of us in that sense at this point in time. But it is an interesting question that we have no longer given our children the kind of leeway, the kind of independence that meant a lot to the early Americans.
Yeah, I think de Tocqueville said that the parental relationship, in particular the paternal relationship, was one where the role of authority had more or less diminished and been replaced by that of tender feelings, right?
That is exactly right. Tender feelings, yes.
Yeah, and this this idea of authority. I'm an economic historian, and so I really thought this insight that the value of labor being so high relative to the value of land explained it to a large degree. But I mean, you'd think this would be true of all frontier societies, right? I mean, do we see similarities in other, so-called frontier societies where, maybe we're thinking like Australia and Canada and, Argentina, right? But I mean, I go to Argentina quite a bit, and I don't see that to the extent that we do in the U.S., even though they too had this sort of, frontier society. I mean, Russia was a frontier society.
I was afraid you were going to mention Russia. Let's bracket Russia for a moment, but let's talk about Argentina. Because, I mean, as you know, one of the things that Tocqueville was very keen on demonstrating was that the colonial background to American development was also very important. And the fact that the Brits were there rather than the Spaniards made a big difference. And I do describe, for example, the differences even in the 19th century between those areas that had Spanish background, like California initially, and those areas that had a British background. The other thing that was, of course, different in, let's say, Australia or Canada, they did not have a revolution. We did. I mean, they were British colonies, but they did not have the revolutionary inheritance that the United States did. And that aspect of the revolution made a huge difference, too. I mean, some of the Jeffersonian language is very clear that we should not impede the next generation. The next generation should define itself. Now, I'm not saying that Australia and Canada don't share things with the United States and have looser family or paternal relations with their children than, say, France or Spain or Italy. They do, in part because of the frontier, and you're quite right to point that out. But they don't have all the factors that existed in the United States, and I think that matters. Russia is an enigma, and Russia's autocracy, which was so intense, and the fact that serfdom really defined the relationship between the aristocracy and the aristocracy, let's just say for now, and ordinary people, really mattered a great deal. I mean, that even in Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire for a long time, the Polish noblemen thought of ordinary people as a different species, not just a different race. They really thought of them in those different kinds of terms. And so when you have a society that's that hierarchical, where the separation between those who occupy a particular class and those who are the serfs or the peasants is so extreme, I don't think the frontier can begin to alter that sufficiently to make the kind of difference we're talking about.
Yeah, and so I was always wondering when I looked at some of these comparisons whether it was really an apples to apples comparison, right? So when you talk about Ulysses Grant and his childhood, where he's out there tilling the fields and horse trading. He's like 8 years old. He's buying and selling horses and stuff.
He's what we would describe, really a kid, and he's out there miles away trading horses on his own account. Because he loved horses, and his father knew that. And so he gave him that leeway. Now, obviously, he made a judgment about whether his son was capable of it. But this is kind of impossible in our minds to think about sending a kid off for that distance, the kind of things that he did. But part of the reason that Ulysses Grant could do that is because he was capable of engaging so many different areas of life. He was not just restricted to school. I mean, there's nothing wrong with school. I don't want to come off of here sounding as if I'm against school. I'm not against school, but school has certain.
He was definitely a free range kid. Like let's be clear, right? Every
What?
kid was a free range kid back then.
This was a free range kid. Good, but we had a recently invented term for that. My friend Lenore Skenazy invented that term, free range kids, because we have so circumscribed their lives, the lives of children. I'm one of those people who's done that. I'm fully aware of what it's like. I did it in part because of my Holocaust background, as you know from my memoir. I was very worried about my children disappearing, but other parents do it for a variety of other reasons these days. But I didn't let my kids out of my sight. That's, I mean, so different than what I learned about America in the 19th century.
But it seems like some of the people who were comparing American childhood to European childhood at the time, they were comparing, these ordinary Americans with the sort of upper class Europeans. I mean, weren't peasants in Europe? I mean, their kids yes. Their kids were out in the fields, right?
Yes, they were. I mean, that's a really good point. I don't mean to interrupt. Absolutely, yes. They were comparing the kids who had nannies and nurseries with American kids who were not of that class. That you're quite right that kids in Europe were working. After the French Revolution, they weren't peasants anymore. I mean, they were, but they were free. They were free citizens. Nevertheless, you are correct that children were working everywhere. The question is what the consequence of their work was. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, they were working because they were told and required to work by their parents, and usually worked for their parents. One of the things that American kids were able to do in agricultural areas, and most of the United States in the 19th century was agricultural. I mean, we tend to forget that, but it is true, is they often worked for other farmers and made money, which gave them the opportunity to then go off on their own. And their opinions were taken into account by their fathers, who literally asked. I'm not saying every single father did this, but fathers included them in deliberations about things that needed to be done around, whether they should move, for example. I have the story of several young boys who decided that their parents should move, that they would have better opportunities in other places like Indiana as opposed to Kentucky. So this kind of incorporation into deliberative questions.
It was almost like a democracy, right? So the families were these democratic institutions where the parents would ask their kids, like, hey, what do you think we should be doing with the farm and stuff?
Exactly. That's that.
Okay, so in other words, the kids became adults very quickly. I mean, they became participating members of this organization, shareholders and executives, right? Relatively quickly.
Your economic history is showing in the words that you're using. Absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm the last gasp of this type of childhood, because when I was growing up as a kid, I mean, I would obviously do a ton of work around the house, but also I would run around and on snow days, I'd shovel snow for the neighbors for money. I'd, rake leaves for money. I remember my sister would shine shoes down at the train station, and we were not poor kids by any means, but we were encouraged to, start earning money relatively early on in our lives and to, be sort of in charge of our lives in many ways. And
where did you grow up?
I grew up outside of Philadelphia, but my parents were both New Yorkers. And, I guess, in New York, you let your kids run around. Right?
I did.
At least they did. Yeah. And so, I was running around the neighborhood, doing my thing, and parents weren't terribly concerned about my whereabouts. But this independence that the kids had, it was in part shaped by the law. You mentioned, right, that there was no primogeniture, that you could leave the land to anybody you wanted, right? This was sort of partially responsible for shaping these relationships, right? Whereas in Europe,
Definitely.
if you didn't, you had to stick by the land, and you had to, make sure you stayed in the good graces of your parents and so forth. And that definitely affected things.
Absolutely. And the absence of laws that constrained parental relations with their children, their sons mostly, but their children in general, I think was also another factor that was different. The US, of course, has common law, and most of the European continent had what was Roman law and then Napoleonic law, which is very different because all the particulars of family relations are laid out and specified. Whereas the common law tradition, and specifically because we had different states with different a legal code, not codes, but laws, meant that there was a large variety, and it did not restrain and constrain parent-child relations. Now, I do want to point out, and I want to make this very clear, that we're talking generally here, that the United States had slavery until 1865.
Yeah.
And nothing that I am describing was true of the lives of slaves. And
well, you also mentioned that even for the white people in the South, their children had very different experiences.
that is correct.
Because of the less democratic strain that persisted in the South.
That is absolutely correct. You're talking about a much more patriarchal society in the South, where women had a lot less role in child rearing. And if it was a slaveholding family, that kind of patriarchalism and control was imposed even more so. And one of the other things that was the case is that in the demographics in the South were different. Older men married younger women to a much greater degree. There could often be 10 to 15 years of difference in age, which was not the case in most of the rest of the United States at that time. But I do want to point that out. I think it's an important thing to note, that we're talking generally here, but it is certainly not true of the African American population.
Now, you mentioned this guy, Adam Goroski, and I didn't know about him. I mean, it sounds like he was sort of a contemporary of de Tocqueville, who was also sort of a foreign observer of our culture.
Yes, and he was an aristocrat, a Polish aristocrat, and his observations were very similar to Tocqueville's. And I use him precisely because, I mean, some people have tried to discount Tocqueville for all kinds of reasons, which I don't find valid. Nevertheless, the fact that others were also coming with similar observations and coming with the same evaluations, which were positive evaluations. I mean, Tocqueville saw these things in positive ways, in part because he foresaw that what was happening in the United States in a democratic, much more egalitarian society would eventually happen in France, and that's what he was interested in. But there were others who came and observed the United States in much more negative ways. A lot of the Brits came and did not like what they saw and compared American children to wild Indians. So the question of whether they approved of it or disapproved of it could have a role to play.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other strain that you talk about that developed in the 19th century was this idea of the primacy of motherhood, right, and the importance of motherhood, and how people began to view Christianity through a more female lens, right, and that God exhibited these female virtues of tenderness and unconditional love and so forth. And I found that fascinating. I mean, was that unique to the U.S. and where did that start? Where did its roots originate?
I'm afraid I can't answer where its roots originated. It is, and I'm not sure it's distinctly American, but it is distinctly evangelical American in the 19th century, where there is a modification of the Calvinist tradition, which was highly patriarchal, centered on an almost Hebraic God who made his judgments in very severe
like,
ways.
Jonathan Edwards and,
Precisely.
he's going to smote you, right?
Precisely. That kind of evangelicalism. And this kind of modification.
Which still persists, I think, in parts of the South, right? In the U.S.
It definitely persists in part of the South. It persists in more than the South as well. I mean, evangelical child rearing today, and it does exist, is still very punitive and very demanding, and has a very different perspective than the today modified, nevertheless still indulgent American child rearing. I mean, I talk about the managed child, but that doesn't mean that most middle class Americans don't see their children as being precious and needing to be carefully brought up, not punished. I mean, we talk today about mild child rearing and things like that. Evangelical child rearing still has a Calvinist tinge to it, what you're describing, and still insists on punishment in a way that most American children today are not physically punished. They're not shamed, and there's a lot less emphasis on guilt than there used to be. Everything that we're saying is within limits. I mean, even though I think there has been a retreat from the kind of child rearing that gave children a significant role in the family in terms of where the direction of the family should go. That doesn't mean that in the past the children were overindulged, and it doesn't mean that today children are highly restricted. Okay, so we have to be careful as we talk about these developments.
Mm-hmm. But this sort of cult of motherhood,
yes.
this led to changes in custody rules, right? So
it did.
Even though the law, at least on paper, was designed to protect the interests of the father, in practice, it ultimately wound up steering custody towards the mother, right?
Steering the custody towards the mother of younger children. It was assumed that the maternal qualities were essential to the upbringing of children. And it's interesting that you've located this religious dimension to it, because I think that's very critical in a highly Protestant society. That one of the things that happens is that the characteristics that are seen as female at a time when there was this division of characteristics between male entrepreneurship and male go-getterism and female merciful softness, etc., was that we began to see the necessity of the female characteristics for young children, that was how young children would be most effectively raised. So that even though the laws were still, as you said, exclusively in the male domain, judges in many places began to give custody where there were separations or divorce to women for younger children, because it was assumed that those qualities were absolutely necessary. This preceded the law. The actions within the courts preceded the actual law.
Mm-hmm. Well, this invention of the domestic sphere, I mean, this came about because more and more men started working outside of the household, right? So presumably back when everybody was on the farm, the division of labor was not quite as distinct, right, between the males and the females.
Yes and no. I mean, even on the farms, certain kinds of work is female work. Collecting eggs is female work. Working in the fields is male work. That doesn't mean that at times when labor was really necessary, women weren't also brought into the fields. But in general, women did not do heavy field work. And women did not, when we introduced the tractor in the late 19th century, women did not sit on tractors. Okay, so there were still distinctions. Men also could help out in the household at certain times, but in general, women were in control of the household and of the garden plot in a farming region. So there was a division, this kind of domestic division of spheres that took place that affected the kind of division of characteristics that we were just talking about. That women had certain characteristics and men. For example, and I'll use the one that shocks my students all the time. Women did not have a sexual drive according to these characteristics. That kind of sexuality accompanied entrepreneurship and go-getterism and the desire, the sexual drive was overwhelmingly a male thing, and women were sheltered from that. So that women's chastity and women's virginity was an outgrowth of their characteristics. As I say, contemporary students are shocked by that when I say women were not supposed to have a sexual drive. But all of those things were part of that very sharp division between male and female that was common in the 19th century.
Well, you also talk about how this notion of the innocent child emerged, right? That, the kids are in need of special protection, right? And that if you saw these orphan kids wandering the streets, that, they needed to be helped. If they were in a household where there was some kind of abuse or violence, they needed to be kind of rescued from that environment as well. And I think he even talked about how sometimes these kids would be shipped off on trains to like other parts of the country to these orphan trains.
Severe abuse. But let's talk about the innocence thing first, because I think that is directly related to the retreat from a Calvinist Protestant vision. And that is the Calvinism, of course, sees nobody as innocent. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. Mm-hmm. So children are born with sin, into sin as a result of sin, and it's only a merciful God that can cleanse them of that. Well, so this innocence was an innocence of women's virginity and of children too. And it was it really introduced a very different perspective on Protestantism and what religion was all about. It was a preservation of innocence that was important. So these things are all interrelated with each other, as culture always is interrelated with the economics, with the social and the political. And so what you get at a certain point is institutions that begin to look out and try to protect the innocence of children and believe that what children require is protection.
And this is where the child labor laws came in, right?
Precisely. That is why the child labor laws came in. They grew out of this perspective that children needed to be protected, and they needed to be protected. And here's the irony. They needed to be protected from their families as well. Mm. Because the idea was that the families were putting those children to work, as they usually were by the late 19th century, if they were going into factories. There was always a distinction in the child labor laws between labor in various industrial settings and labor on the farm. The farm labor laws did not affect farm labor because there was still the view that the farm brought out the independence of children, whereas the factory encouraged the dependence of children and undermined the kind of citizenship that you would want in children. So that the child labor laws were all about sweatshops, which weren't exactly factories, or even home labor, which was very common in immigrant households by the late 19th century. And so here the protection was against the family itself and frequently intruded in the family and family decisions. So we today have a very complex response to that. It's the government interfering in family life.
Well, these child labor laws came in around the same time as mandatory schooling, right? And the idea was that
the same time.
Kids needed to be educated or could not be deprived of education. And it's interesting because it seems like almost every person who writes about education, going back to Dewey and even further back, they'll say that education exists in order to encourage independence, right? And in order to encourage enterprise and so forth. And it seems like as long as we've had schools, we've had people criticizing the school system for, failing to do that, right? For being too regimented and too authoritative and so forth. Although the one thing that I found fascinating was that the teaching in schools was primarily a female occupation.
Thank you.
And I thought that was just driven by sort of, labor availability. But you mentioned that this was also part and parcel of this idea that they needed to be exposed to the caring of the women.
Yes, that's right. We were the only, as far as I know, we were the only Western society where women dominated teaching by the middle of the 19th century. Everywhere else, teaching was still a male profession. And you're quite right that part of it had to do with labor, with the need for labor. And part of it had to do, interestingly, with the fact that women were also being educated. And a lot of places women were not. And you couldn't have a teacher unless there was at least a modicum of education. So again, we go back to these circles within circles that connect with each other. On the one hand, you wanted to have as cheap labor as you possibly could because you were extending extending education, or schooling at any rate. On the other hand, you needed to draw on a cheaper labor force, which made women a more available labor force. And then you also had on top of that this cultural vision that women had the qualities that would make them effective teachers for young children. Not in the high schools. Of course, very few people in the middle of the 19th century went to high schools. They were called academies at the time, and most of them weren't free. But here's a relationship here with the Innocence. Female teachers were fired as soon as they were married because they might get pregnant. And children's innocence might be violated by seeing pregnant teachers. So,
I thought, Claudia Golden said that the reason why they got rid of them is because the husbands would come in and start making trouble and demanding, more pay and better treatment. And so that's why they wouldn't let these married women teach.
Well, I far be it from me to dispute anything that Claudia Golden says, someone I admire enormously, as one of the first really serious economists who took schooling seriously and understood its value and its importance. So let's just say that there could be more than one factor involved.
Right. Well, she also wrote about the rise of high schools, and
yes,
it's really remarkable. I mean,
yes.
You cite some statistics how, Ohio had more high schools than like all of France or something like this. And it's, I mean, in some ways it's a continuation of the higher literacy rates that we saw in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. probably had the highest literacy rate, excepting the slave population, had the highest literacy rates anywhere in the world almost.
Well, that was an expression of republicanism, the idea that you wanted a literate citizenry. It goes back to the revolution and the idea that a citizen had to be able to make judgments on his own. Yes, we had the highest literacy rates. Yes.
And then these high schools came in, right? And these high schools, they, I think you argue, became sort of the defining feature of American childhood, and that they kind of emerged at the same time as the invention of adolescence, right? That adolescence didn't really exist in America before we came up with the high school.
You needed an institution in which adolescence could be expressed and where the kind of adolescent peer culture could take root. And so, yes, adolescence and the high school did come together. And the high school was also, what we're talking about now is a 20th century phenomenon. Okay, let's be clear. This is no longer the 19th century we're talking about. In the late 19th century, the proportion of young people of high school age who were in high school was no greater than 5 to 10%, with 5% being the men and 10% being the women.
Well, and some people could start. Some people would start university at 14 and 15.
Yes,
right,
that is also
the high school was invented.
Yes, that's true. The high school, in a sense, didn't exist. You went to an academy which trained you to go into a college if that's what you were going to do. So what we're talking about is a 20th century phenomenon. And in the United States, by the 1930s, which is the Depression decade, in the United States by the 1930s, 50% of all high school age students go to high school. The proportion in Europe is minuscule. I mean, we're talking about the lycée or the gymnasium. I mean, these are tiny, very highly privileged populations. But in the United States, it's expanded, and it grows during the Depression, in part because of the fact that people are unemployed. What we're talking about are free high schools. These are democratic schools that are provided for by the state and by the localities. So it is a tremendous phenomenon which has very important consequences for immigrants as well. Mm-hmm. Because immigrants start going to high school and the adolescent peer culture begins to really have major consequences for immigrant assimilation. So it's not only the school itself which helps to assimilate young immigrants, but the peer culture within the schools has an enormous influence, so that young immigrants start talking back to their parents. I mean, immigrants come in with a very different background vision of where the child fits. It's much more patriarchal. It's much more hierarchical. And yet they're exposed in the high school to a whole other vision of themselves. And they come in and they negate what their parents are saying. It leads to tremendous conflict within immigrant families.
And that's always been true, right? So in the 19th century,
yes.
If they came from Italy or Poland, right? If they came from Italy or Poland today, it wouldn't be a big deal. But now they're coming primarily from Latin America or from Asia or Africa, yes. And so it seems like throughout our history, no matter where you came from, you were going to encounter this clash, this challenge where the patriarchal authority was going to be undermined when you got here. I mean, you hear these stories about some of these immigrants from countries where the honor of their daughters is super important, and it leads to these terrible conflicts within the families when the daughters assert their Americanness, right?
And your point is really well taken. I mean, the fact that there is a repeated experience of this kind with different kinds of immigrants coming in. But I mean, the honor of the daughter reminds you, of course, of Sicilian families who came in the early 20th century, where the honor of the daughter was extremely important. Or other Catholic families as well, but especially Italian families. You, I'm sure, understand that part of what's going on today in the world is the globalization of certain American visions of the woman and the family that is a tremendous insult and creates great fear in large parts of the world, especially in Middle Eastern countries and in Islamic countries. So what we're talking about is the difference between America, which developed over a long period of time, as we've been talking here, from the early 19th century, confronting very different cultures in the rest of the world around issues of children, women, and so it's not exclusively economic. These cultural phenomena create great conflicts in the world today.
Well, the other thing you talk about is how Americans started looking to scientists and, psychologists and, parental experts. And I thought the first big book was Dr. Spock's book, but you said no, there have been books on child rearing going back for a long time. And then there's been these magazines like Parenting and Ladies' Home Journal. And so this is where people would go to for advice. And I can't imagine that this was big in other parts of the world. You'd probably go to your priest or your grandparents or somebody else for parental advice.
Absolutely. You would go to your priest or your grandparents, which, by the way, is happening more now than it used to. People going back to their grandparents, the neglect of grandparents in the earlier part of the 20th century. But by the 1920s, you have different schools of child rearing advice. You have the Freudian school of child rearing advice, which is embedded in Parents Magazine, which emerges in the middle of the 1920s and becomes a very popular magazine. And then you have John Watson, the Watsonian behavioral view of child rearing, where he is extremely dismissive of mothers, by the way, where he thinks there's over-mothering in the United States, and he believes that mothers spoil and ruin their children for life, which is a very different perspective. And so, but you've got now the incorporation of psychological perspectives in child rearing, overweighing what comes from the family itself. That sets up a whole 20th century tradition where the women in the family begin to lose their sense of they knowing, on the basis of their characteristic, knowing what's best for children. That whole division of spheres of the 19th century is now overwhelmed by a male, almost always male expertise, which begins to challenge women's role in the family. That doesn't get set back until Dr. Spock. Until right after World War II and during the 50s, when Spock tells mothers, you know what? Follow your instincts. You know more than you think you do. Mm-hmm. That is, in fact, a return to an earlier investing of women with a perspective on child rearing. Because by then, the erosion of their sense of confidence was such, we're talking largely about middle-class women, but not exclusively. And I want to say something about that. The erosion of their sense of confidence was such that Spock literally had to say to them, you have enough confidence. You can do it. Well, I'll help you. I'll give you some advice. You can always turn to my book, but you can know what you're doing. Okay. So I think that's a fascinating aspect of the 20th century. And today, of course, women's confidence is so undermined, in part because of the internet. Everybody has a different perspective on what you should do in terms of raising your children. I mean,
like mommy blogs, and there's this whole industry, right, where people are their fears and anxieties are being
being shamed
yeah.
for not doing it right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of the reason why the scientists got so much deference was that they actually did play a huge role in extending the lives of children, right? I mean, you point out how this notion that you're supposed to die before your children, that's actually a relatively recent thing. I mean, that's just a 20th century idea.
It is,
right? I mean, most of the time, most of your kids would die before you
yes.
In all of human history leading up to the 20th century.
You know, one of the realities is that most of the people in the past were children, but they died before they became adults. That was not really reversed until the late 19th century, to some degree, because of the cleaning up of water supplies and things like that, and the introduction of a variety of vaccines, above all smallpox and diphtheria. Diphtheria was a major killer of children, and a variety of other children's diseases. The water was crucial. Infants died because of various kinds of intestinal problems that were the result of bad water. But doctors did come into play, mostly as a result of the introduction of antibiotics, sulfa drugs and antibiotics during the war, in effect, during the Second World War. But doctors were there to vaccinate children, to monitor their growth charts of children, height, weight, nutritional advice. Some of that was already distributed by the Children's Bureau, starting in the late teens and 20s. The Children's Bureau was the one and only child agency in American history. It was organized by women who were concerned about the welfare of children, and the welfare not just of middle-class children, but of all children. And they published pamphlets on child rearing advice that were distributed through legislative offices. So it went out to millions of Americans through these little pamphlets on child rearing. So even though parents may not have had access to or been able to afford something like a parent's magazine, they could get for free a pamphlet on child rearing. And the Children's Bureau also sent around various kinds of promoting children's health fairs into towns and cities across the country, where they'd weigh the children, they'd have nurses give advice on child welfare, so that children did begin to survive much better than ever before in the United States and some Western other countries as well, because of these activities. So it wasn't just that they were cutting down on women's roles, it's that they were actually encouraging children's welfare. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad. One other thing that we don't often pay attention to is that people got child rearing advice on the radio. The radio was introduced in the 20s as well. And to my surprise, there were lots of radio programs aimed at parents. And that gave various kinds of advice to parents. They drew upon experts, drew upon doctors. So even if you had access to a radio and there were columns in newspapers that gave various kinds of advice too. So the United States, by the middle of the 20th century, was inundated with various kinds of advice about children, some of which had very positive effects on children's welfare. Others created more dissension until Dr. Spock came into play.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest trend that we've seen in recent times is the smaller size of families and the older age of parents. And this has led to, I guess, investment in quality over quantity, right? Where
Definitely.
education is supreme and at a premium. And most of the people that I talk to, when they look at contemporary parenthood, it seems like they fall into two camps. One camp says that kids are, overindulged, and the other camp says that they're over-controlled, right? I mean, can both be true?
Yes, I do think both are true. They are I don't want to use the word overindulged. I think there's a lot of uh, awareness of children's needs, emphasis on children's well-being that's taken place. I won't describe that as an overindulgence. It is different than what happened in the 19th century, where there was not that much room for worrying so much about what your children were doing and worrying about what kinds of things they were playing with and making sure they had appropriate reading material. Again, I won't call that overindulgence. Child consciousness. I mean, awareness of what you think children might need. Yes. At the same time as that can lead to, and often does lead to, over control because of anxiety that the child makes sure that they're up to their reading level and beyond it. Make sure that they're getting all the kind of after-school activities that'll give them an appropriate CV for entering college. So those things are related to each other. I mean, the emphasis on control grows out of and is an unfortunate expression of the desire to advance your children's interests. It's also a desire to advance the parents' interests. I mean, the parents want their children to be successful and to parents are both very giving and very selfish. It's just part of human nature. I mean, and that's expressed into their children. They want their children to be good reflections on them. They also are loving and affectionate and adore their children and want their children to flourish and to develop effectively. So you now have you put your finger on it, and there's a demographic issue that's involved here, and that is starting in the early 20th century. We have reduced the size of families. The 1950s and early 60s with the baby boom was an anomaly. That was extremely unusual, the growth of family size. So we're now...
I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood where there were families with 10 kids,
You
8
did?
kids, 6 kids, 5.
How many children were in your family?
We had 3, and we were the smallest family in the neighborhood. I think it's because the real estate agents would funnel all the Catholics into the same neighborhood. And so, so we're surrounded by a bunch of Irish Catholic families that had a gazillion kids.
Yes, but we are now returning to the trend that was interrupted by the baby boom. And now we're returning, as many people are now aware, because it's all over the newspapers, we now have a non-replacement demographic. 1.67, I think, is the average size, the average number of children born to women during their fertile periods. So, and I don't know how to predict that, but I can say something about why I think that's happened. Part of it is economic, unquestionably. I mean, the movement of women into the workforce that began in large numbers of married women, because unmarried women had been in the workforce since the early 20th century, but married women in the workforce started in the 1970s and 80s, and I mean really has exploded since then. And married women with young children, with very young children, is a phenomenon of the last 50 years in the American workforce. That has a huge effect on the number of children that women can bear, want to bear, can support in terms of energy and time, even with the assistance of their husbands or whatever.
I've seen statistics that say that mothers are now spending more time parenting than they did even back when they weren't in the workforce.
That's true, but they're not in the house. They're not at home. So, I mean, they may be spending time mothering, but you were out in the street playing with your friends. I was out in the street playing with my friends, but my mother was at home. I bet your mother was at home too. And that
Yeah.
meant that one of the reasons you could trust having your kids on the street is you knew that all the mothers in the neighborhood were at home. And
Right.
therefore, even if you weren't taking care of your children, someone was at the window looking out there. Some
Yeah, or
mother,
you'd wander into somebody else's house and
yes,
start
and you
eating
did do that.
their food, right? Yeah.
Precisely. And you did do that. So, but
Uh-huh.
that has now disappeared, even in suburbs. So
Right.
you don't, it's not just that your mother's not home, but there aren't any mothers at home. So the fear about children being outdoors or being away from adult supervision is partly related to that. There's also,
Mhm.
we talked about it earlier, all of this explosion of bullying and shaming online about being a good parent. Who wants to expose themselves to that? So we are now in a situation where parenting is so fraught that young people just don't want to do it. And
Mhm.
given effective contraception, the birth rate has declined radically. We are now catching up with Europe, with Italy and Spain and France and Germany, who've had a declining birth rate now for longer than we have.
Well, look, you talk about some of the contemporary parental advice books. You mentioned Amy Chua's book and others. I mean, do you think that the contemporary parenting is kind of drawing this era of American uniqueness to a close? I mean, is the notion of the independent child something which is no longer seen as a virtue, or is it that we need different types of characteristics to succeed in the modern world? I mean, you mentioned that what we're primarily training our kids for is to succeed in educational environments. And, that's not necessarily right what it takes to succeed once you exit the educational environment.
I think both of those are true. I think it's true that we are now in a very different environment, and children need a different upbringing than they did in the 19th century. So I think that's without question true. Is the American difference gone? Is the American way? Well, that's what's implied in my title, "The End of American Childhood." Um, that the
But is
kind
it
of
ending because the rest of the world also wants independent children, or is it that we no longer value those traits of independence that we once valued?
we value them to some degree, but not the way we used to. I think that we still we talk about autonomy a lot, and autonomy is usually framed in psychological terms these days, where the child can function autonomously. But the kind of independence that used to be at the top of our list of things that we wanted our children to grow into, I think that's much less the case. I have friends who have asked me, because they're themselves business people and entrepreneurs, whether I think this will have a negative consequences for entrepreneurship in the United States. And I think it could. It could. I mean, one of the realities that we talked about at the very beginning is the intersection between politics and economics and the way children are brought up. And certainly the way American children were brought up in the 19th century and even in the 20th century um, led to an emphasis on the kind of entrepreneurial, innovative spirit that the American economy has prided itself on. And it's not clear to me, and I'm not an economic historian, and I'm not an economist, it's not clear to me whether we are any longer providing children with the kind of home structures that would pivot them into those roles. It is certainly possible that we've come to the point where what we prided ourselves on as Americans will no longer be the dominant form of American enterprise and American life. Yes, it's possible. And that would be related to child rearing.
Well, I think you said somewhere in the book that it's almost impossible to define a single type of American childhood because there's so many. But I think this book is really a wonderful history of a topic which has received far too little attention. Paula, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Your questions and all of that have been wonderful. Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.